Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about album number 2, mainline album number 2 from Squarepusher, Hard Normal Daddy. My god, Hard Normal Daddy. I can barely even begin to describe this freaking album. I mean, maybe some people looking into Squarepusher for the first time might be put off by the album title here, which is admittedly pretty terrible and reeks of LOL, pedophile jokes are funny. Might be the RDJ influence there too. I think that was around the time of I would like some milk from the milkman's wife's tits. But really, the title is irrelevant. This album marks not only Tom Jenkinson's upgrade from Reflex to Warp Records, the earliest available album of his on Spotify, unfortunately, and a doubling down on what made Feed Me Weird Things work so well. It's more distinctive sounding than his debut and more unique to him specifically, and it's basically better in every way. This was actually also the album that convinced me I needed to get into Squarepusher. I mean, at first I wasn't sure given the title and possibly the fact that I might have previewed some of the more aggressive tracks on here first. I have no idea why. But at some point I eventually listened to a preview of Cooper's World, and it was so absolutely brilliant I knew I had to get into this guy as soon as possible. I mean, before I go into this album, I should mention two of my all-time favorite albums that fall outside of the electronic music world. More specifically, my two favorite film soundtracks of all time are, I've mentioned this before, but Herbie Hancock's Death Wish and Lalo Schifrin's Bullet soundtracks. I only have the Bullet soundtrack on CD right now, but need to get Death Wish at some point, since I've been listening to that one longer. Basically, these are like jazz soundtracks that combine the looseness and interesting harmonies of jazz music with the emotional power, the atmosphere, and even orchestral polish of film soundtracks. I mean, far from the only two to go for this particular aesthetic, but they are so effective at what they do that I found them almost infinitely re-listenable and still get massive value out of them to this day. And of course, the reason I bring these soundtracks up in the first place is because both of them are credited directly from Tom Jenkinson himself, citation needed, as direct influences on this album. I know I've read that somewhere, I just can't find the interview right at this moment. Combine these jazz soundtrack fusion vibe of the Death Wish soundtrack with the hyper-speed drum and bass rhythms and weird synth textures of the IDM scene in '97, and you got yourself an instant classic right there. This was something I was guaranteed to love, and that first track, Cooper's World, right off the bat showed the potential of such awesome genre combination. Fast-paced, jazzy, mysterious, but also catchy as well. It's a track that I just listened to over and over and over and just never seemed to get sick of. Well, okay, maybe not never got sick of, but I still love it now. But that was only the starting point. Going on from there, going down track by track, obviously. Next is Beep Street, which was a bit more laid back, at least melody-wise, but not beat-wise. The beats are still just as fast-paced as the previous track. Again, most of the tracks on this album are the same tempo. But somehow, like on Beep Street, we got a track which manages to capture an almost equally effective appeal to Cooper's World, but also be great on its own merits. The melodies here might even be catchier than the opener, and they got this weird sadness to them almost, if not for the fast pace of the track that makes these melodies put me in a good mood instead. I think I might like the punchiness and instantaneous appeal of Cooper's World a little more, given how I am a sucker for jazz instrumentation and electronic music, and Beep Street is a lot more synth-heavy. But it's no less brilliant. It's actually a pretty similar move to Squarepusher theme in Tundra at the beginning of Feed Me Weird Things, which is a similarly brilliant pair of tracks to start you out on, but again, I think this album does it a little bit better. So yeah, right from the get-go, you got two of my favorite IDM tracks of all time, if you want to call them IDM. Now, admittedly, those are my two favorite tracks on the album as well. By far my most listened to Squarepusher tracks without question, and the remaining 10 don't hit quite the same lofty heights as those first two, but that doesn't mean they're any less brilliant out of context. Hell, since they've been listened to less frequently, I'm much more likely to catch something on these tracks that I missed before. Take the next track, Rustic Raver, for instance. That one's a lot more aggressive and noisy than the previous track, hard-hitting, lots of harsh acid synths. It didn't used to be a major favorite of mine, but I did notice while listening to it for the review, this one breakdown where Jenkinson started sequencing the acid synths as if they were a live bass guitar solo. I'm not sure how I never noticed that part before, but it is awesome. And the rest of that track is pretty catchy too for what it is. Moving on, Anurag D9 has a lot of these haunting synth string textures. Even if this track is the shortest on the album at only over a minute, it definitely leaves an impact on me. And Chin Hippie, meanwhile, is kind of the North Circular of this album. Mostly just a percussion jam, and not a major highlight for me personally. But also like North Circular, it's also not a skippable track, and I'd argue it works better here as helping to find variety in the album. Chin Hippie is actually significantly more aggressive than North Circular, and it sticks out more than that one did. Papalon thankfully takes things back into the territory I usually like. More of a chill, jazzy track with mysterious soundtracky melodies and some cool, like, clarinet sounds in some areas. It's a nice touch. It goes on for 8 minutes, and while not as instantly memorable as the first 2 tracks on this album, it's consistently interesting and does still maintain a little bit of that catchiness. E8 Boogie, meanwhile, showcases Jenkinson's bass playing abilities again. The fact that he's able to keep up with a beat is pretty astounding, as usual. And he also brings in the synth texture that's somewhere in between your usual old-school 808 State new build acid synths and the squirty keyboard sounds you'd find on an old Herbie Hancock album like Headhunters, you know, back in his prime period. A lot of fun to be had on that track, of course. And then Fat Controller turns down the tempo closer to walking pace, but despite not being nearly as fast-paced as the rest of this album, it may very well be the most hard-hitting track on the album. It's got this really harsh and industrial vibe to it, the synths are really gritty and noisy, but there's also something strangely addicting and catchy about it. And Jenkinson is nice enough to include some of his top-notch bass playing in other sections. One of the most fun tracks on here for sure. Vic Acid, meanwhile, is another track that I thought I liked more than I actually did going into this review. Kinda like the Swiftie, sort of, but I think I like that one more. Vic Acid is not the most interesting track, again, mainly just amen breaks and synths we've already heard elsewhere on this album. But I do still very much like the sound of it, out of context. The little bass synth melody is cool. And I also think it's excusable that this one isn't as, you know, standout, because I think he made this track before the rest of this album. At least it was released as a pre-album single beforehand, so yeah. Not a standout, but this is still good. Anyways, we move on to Male Pill Part 13. I think the part number on this is just some, like, arbitrary joke, by the way. Like, he has other parts of Male Pill. I think there's a part 5 somewhere, but there's definitely not 13 parts as far as I know. Regardless, this track goes back to the jazzier side of things. It's probably the least catchy of these jazzy tracks on this album, but it's still got an undeniable groove like all the others, and it's got quite a bit going on and all over it. Plenty of mysterious side tracks all around to keep me interested if I happen to be paying attention to it. And then there's Rats/P's and Q's, which does not sound like 2 separate tracks despite the forward slash in the title. But this is another highlight that's grown on me more recently. It's got this really creepy and dissonant vibe to it that creates this really nice atmosphere. Certainly not as smooth or ghostly as the creepier stuff from Feed Me Weird Things, it's a lot more jittery and paranoid. But still, really cool track here. And finally we close out with Rebus, which unfortunately is not the most memorable of closers either. However, I am much more okay with this as an ending than the last album. Like, this track does half the tempo and go on the more chill side. It feels like it's slowing down the album and putting on the brakes, in either spelling, because we've reached our destination. Point is, unlike Future Given, it feels like thought was actually put into this being the ending, so I appreciate it all the more in that regard. Now, overall, I'll admit Hard Normal Daddy is not a perfect album. It comes out with its best material right at the very beginning and doesn't deliver strongly later on, even though it is pretty consistently fun and engaging for the remainder, as I mentioned. But on top of that, you know, I say that the Death Wish and Bullet soundtracks are almost infinitely replayable for me personally. I will unfortunately have to admit that Hard Normal Daddy is not quite on that level. I have definitely had listens of this album in the past where I just didn't really get much out of it because I had just listened to it into the ground and got sick of it. Like, as much as I adore Cooper's World and Beep Street, there's not much new insight I can take from those two at this point anymore since I've listened to them so freaking much over the years and have basically memorized how they go. But still, if it surprises I want, that's what the rest of the album is for. Maybe not as catchy as those first two, but still plenty of interesting details and lots of love and effort put into every track, so I'm never bored at any point. So yeah, at the end of the day, Hard Normal Daddy is not only my personal favorite Squarepusher album, it's the album I'd most highly recommend as an intro to him if you're not already familiar with the guy, and it's one of my personal all-time favorite albums, period. So obviously, go check it out if you haven't already, and I'm overall feeling a solid 9 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it, so that's all for today, see you next time.